Hey everyone, Eric Grenier here, and welcome to the 104th episode of the Writ Podcast. It was a cabinet shuffle this week in Ottawa, and a pretty big one, a lot bigger than I think a lot of us expected. So to break down what it all means, I'm joined by the CBC's Aaron Wherry and Stephanie Levitz of the Toronto Star. Aaron and Stephanie, thanks for joining me.
Hi.
Anytime.
We'll get into some of the details and all that kind of stuff, but Stephanie, maybe you want to kick us off. What struck you the most about this? What was the big takeaway, the big story from this shuffle?
I mean, the top line story that the Prime Minister once told is putting a refreshed bench in front of Canadians to a degree, of course. He kept some of his senior allies quite close to him, putting a reinvigorated message on the government. I mean, a little bit of it, to borrow a colloquial phrase, is like putting lipstick on a pig. I mean, it's not to say that along with this cabinet shuffle is coming a throne speech or a reset of a legislative agenda or any of the other meaty things that would mean the government is embracing a refreshed direction. They're just putting a refreshed slate of people in front of these files. What does that mean materially? Are we going to see changes? Are we going to see differences? I'm not really sure about that. So, as my colleague Susan Delacourt wrote in The Star, it was a bit of a branding exercise for Justin Trudeau insofar as hammering home some of his key messages about diversity, about gender parity, about younger Canadians embracing them. All of that was there. Not surprising. Some of the big names, of course, though, that got dropped, that's the part that was surprising. This sort of beheading of some folks. Many people thought Marco Mendicino, he's had a lot of problems on his file, was on his way out the door. But to outright drop David Lametti, to kick Mona Fortier to the curb, those two things just seemed a bit shocking in how cold they were and sort of unprecipitated by any rumblings that these two names in particular were on the chopping block. And of course, the people who'd already said they weren't running again and also didn't make it into cabinet.
And with those people, there's always the open question of whether they're not running again because they knew this was coming, or they're not running again because for some of them they've been there for a very long time, so it makes sense. But that there is that open question, so which we can't really answer. But Aaron, do you kind of, because a lot of the coverage we've seen, a lot of the reaction so far has been that it's largely style over substance in terms of this cabinet shuffle. Is that how you kind of see it as well?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's a lot of change just in the sort of very practical, the number of people that have moved around and the number of departments and portfolios that now have new ministers. I mean, I think the amount of change surprised me, but at the same time, yeah, as I wrote, like Chrystia Freeland's still the finance minister. Francois Philippe Champagne is still the innovation minister. Guilbeault and Wilkinson are still in charge of climate and resources. And, Justin Trudeau is still the prime minister. So I don't know how much this actually changes. I think the government being fairly straightforward when they say that this was about putting the best people on sort of the most important files. And in some cases, they felt they already had the right people on the right files. Putting Sean Fraser on housing, I think that really is about communication and politics and trying to get sort of back into the fight with Pierre Poilievre on that file. Things like that, I think, are not insignificant moves, but, for all of the change that we did see here, and there was a lot of change, this isn't going to be a fundamentally different government going forward. This isn't, the government didn't suddenly change its approach to everything yesterday.
It's fashionable to say how, ministers are not that important. They're just kind of figureheads, communications people, that kind of thing. Stephanie, was there any changes here that are going to be substantive in terms of someone's ability to actually make change in terms of policy, how the government's going to be functioning, that kind of thing?
Well, to the point about ministers don't matter, I would argue that in certain key portfolios, the minister actually really does matter because it's a lot about building relationships with stakeholder communities. And one of the things that I found remarkable was the choice to move Mark Miller out of Crown and Indigenous Relations and over to immigration. Now, immigration is a portfolio where relationships with stakeholders are crucial. I mean, you're talking about, potentially not just the economic future fortunes of this country. You're talking about family reunification. You're talking about refugees. Anyone who's ever covered the immigration file also knows that ministers are left dealing with some of the most heart-wrenching personal stories that are out there about people who are desperate to be reunited with their family or hire labor for their sinking business. It's really hard. Mark Miller comes from a file where he was confronted with the angst and the heartbreak of reconciliation every single day. And he made a lot of relationships along the way trying to drive forward reconciliation as being a centerpiece of this Liberal government's agenda. That was meaningful, powerful work. And into that file has come a complete and total rookie. And I wonder about that. I wonder about what that does to the government's reconciliation agenda when we know that part of reconciliation is building trust, it's building community, it's being able to listen and understand, and to have to effectively redo all of that work with a brand new cabinet minister. I find that challenging. So it's sort of the opposite of what you're asking me, Eric, like meaningful difference, as opposed to I'm seeing it the other way, which is what sort of meaningful things has this government been trying to do that now may in fact be hampered by decisions that Justin Trudeau has made. I think to answer your question more directly, on the public safety file, putting Dominic LeBlanc in charge of that, and Mr. Ministerial of Janitorial Responsibilities, as he likes to call himself, he's always cleaning up trouble. There's a lot of trouble on that file. And it's possible that a fresh minister there can reset some of those tense relationships, especially when it comes to the pending gun legislation. The first legislative fight starting in September is going to be that gun bill. It's sitting in the Senate. It's not going anywhere. The Liberals really want to get it out the door. So there could be a way for Dominic LeBlanc to be a bit of a refresh on that, get the government's agenda back on track for them, and build some new relationships there, because Marco Mendicino's relationships had become non-existent on that particular file.
Yeah, Aaron, are there any, like Stephanie said, that can be either good or bad, right? It could be that it'll have a bad impact on governance and all this kind of thing. But beyond the politics, beyond the electoral kind of side of it, changes that will have an impact on just how the government functions.
So, I mean, I do think the idea that ministers don't matter is kind of a lazy take at this point. I understand that, yes, ministers don't completely write the government's agenda on a file, right? The climate minister, Stephen Guilbeault, is not on his own coming up with the government's climate agenda. But the ability to move stuff forward, get stuff done, stay out of trouble, handle communications, take tough questions, represent the government in the House, all of that stuff comes down to who the minister is. And we have seen examples of where that has not worked out, either because stuff hasn't moved or because things have become unnecessary problems. With all due respect to Marco Mendicino, I hate to kick him while he's down, but that's an example of where a minister just wasn't on top of things and his office wasn't handling things well, and it bogged down the government. So this idea that ministers don't matter, I think, is just sort of outdated. And I would also latch onto the same example Stephanie had, which is I would not have guessed that Mark Miller would ever move from Crown Indigenous Relations. That seemed like kind of his job for as long as he wanted it. The fact that they're moving him out, my assumption can only be that they think they've gotten that file, that department, to a place where it doesn't necessarily need a heavy hand or even his hand necessarily guiding it any further. That it's got some stability, it's got some momentum. And at the same time, immigration is a file that needs a heavy hand at times, both to handle the politics and to handle just the management of that department. And so my guess would be that they feel they need him more in immigration now than they need him at Crown Indigenous Relations. The file, though, that I think the biggest question in terms of policy-wise is still housing. I don't know that Sean Fraser is going to come in with a bunch of different ideas or approaches to that file, but if they've just moved him there for communications, assistance or support, I don't think that's necessarily going to win the day for them. There has to be some more policy coming behind him, and that's going to have to come both from him and from finance and from some other departments to really get things moving, because the emphasis, there was a lot of emphasis yesterday on communication and putting our best communicators in places, but not that isn't a problem for this government, but I'm not even sure it's the first or primary problem.
Right. If you have a bad idea or a bad strategy, communicating it well is not going to change that the idea is bad or the strategy is bad, right? So it's not just a question of communications. If we get into some of the specifics of the people involved, we've already done that a little bit, but Stephanie, there was, promotions, people who got promoted to cabinet. A lot of them are not very well-known figures. There was some surprising omissions, I would say, from those, but also within cabinet, right? People who got bigger jobs, different portfolios. Is there any that you think are notable that say something about why they're promoting someone, what they saw in this new minister or this minister is going to be given a better role?
One example, I mean, that's obvious and off the top, is Rechi Valdez, who is an absolute rookie member of Parliament, elected class of 2021. However, she is from Mississauga, Streetsville. And when Transport Minister Omar Al-Gabra announced that he was suddenly deciding not to run again, and oh, look at that, he's no longer in cabinet, the question of how would the Prime Minister fill the Mississauga seat, for lack of a better thing. I mean, the GTA is enormously important to the Liberals' political fortunes, and making sure that they have folks that represent the diversity of the communities in the GTA sitting around the cabinet table, bringing a voice forward. Rechi Valdez, the government says, is the first Filipino-Canadian woman to ever become a member of Parliament. Now she becomes the first Filipino-Canadian female cabinet minister. So that's one of those decisions she was handed the Minister for Small Business, which is interesting because that was her background exactly. In the time right before she entered politics. She ran an on-demand specialty bakery. And so I think that one was one of those clear political signals about what the government wants to do in terms of shoring up its base of support in a particular community by elevating someone, pushing forward a young woman who, potentially has the private sector track record to do this job. So that would be one. A second one, if you would go all the way over to the West Coast, I would look at Terry Beach, promoted into this newly created Ministry of Citizen Services, which I don't know what that's going to mean. It was kind of funny, in the scrums when he didn't really seem to know what it meant either. There's some argument to be made that isn't citizen services another word for federal government? Like, does it need its own minister? Is he the chief butler of the government? I'm not sure. However, Mr. Beach has been grinding it out on the West Coast, again with Joyce Murray, suddenly again deciding she wasn't going to run again. She's from British Columbia. They needed somebody to replace that regional spot. So they, go for a grinder in this instance, right? Someone who's been toiling it on the back benches, very good for them, is always there, does what the boss asks, and so gets a bump into cabinet. So it's sort of two different things there, right? You're looking at somebody for a political stronghold, and you're also looking, because one of the things about these cabinet shuffles, right, is in as much as there's 38 odd people who had a really great day yesterday, there's a lot of people who didn't, and who are angry, and who feel passed over. And this is a government where there is no great certainty they will continue to hold on to governing in the next election. So if you've been grinding it out for Justin Trudeau for these last few years, this might have been your last shot at ever making it into a Justin Trudeau Liberal cabinet. So he's got to do some backbench managing, and that's where you see guys like Terry Beach get the nod to recognize those who've been working in the trenches.
Yeah, I want to talk about some of the those people on the outside who might be a little upset. But if we're still, Aaron, promotions beyond the Beach and Valdez, any that catch your eye, and including those who were already a cabinet but have now a more prominent role?
If it is a promotion, I think it is. Moving Bill Blair to defense, I think, is a curious move. In certain ways, it makes sense. I can see why they would put him there, and I can see sort of the message they wanted to send, or the kind of, him sort of fitting with that ministry. But I don't, after all of the talk not that long ago about reforming the military and bringing in Canada's, bringing in a woman defense minister and really changing the tone of things, to move Anita Anand out of there as quickly as they did is curious, and we'll probably get to that at some point. In terms of the broader promotion issue, I think it's kind of a double-edged sword. This is more movement than I think they've made really in any other cabinet shuffle before, in terms of sending people out and bringing people in. And so, they may, to a certain extent, want to sell this as look, we, if you are, a good backbencher, if you succeed as a Liberal MP, if you've got something to say for yourself, there are opportunities. You're gonna, there's a chance you could get promoted. Maybe that's the message they're hoping to send with these 7 promotions. But as Steph says, this government, is not guaranteed another 5 years, another 10 years. So who knows how many more cabinet shuffles there are going to be. And so I don't know. There is going to be a fair bit of, I think, caucus management that has to be done coming out of this, to give people roles, to give people jobs, to make people feel involved going into the next election. Because the last thing they want is a raft of departures and having to worry about protecting, seats that they already hold. I do think Terry Beach is an interesting, both the job and him personally, it's an interesting story. I mean, if you go back to the first term, he was a guy who was supposed to be as good as defeated after they bought the TMX, after they approved the TMX pipeline, and then especially after they bought it. He was supposed to be donezo, and the fact that he's still here is pretty remarkable. And then the fact that they've given him this job, and we'll see what it actually amounts to. But it's interesting for a couple of reasons. One is this government's ability to deliver services has come under question not that long ago, and still to a certain degree. They seem to have gotten things under control, but they probably realize they can't afford too many more stories like we had, I guess, last summer about passport lineups. The other piece is there's still, I don't know, maybe this is my own fixation, but there's still the issue of EI reform that is out there somewhere that they're supposed to be doing at some point. And there's some suggestion that he has some responsibility for EI now. So he's presumably one of these ministers that could be involved on that. And I'm interested to see whether this job that he has now ends up involving that, or whether EI reform is something that will be put off until the next generation of Trudeaus are in government.
Stephanie, I don't know if you had anything to add on the Bill Blair, because that one to me kind of was a surprise. He doesn't strike me as an underperforming minister, but not one who's an overperforming minister. And to get national defense at a time when there's war in Ukraine, when there's, as Aaron said, there's this time about reforming sort of the environment inside the armed forces. That seems like an interesting one, especially when Anand seemed to be doing a pretty well-respected job there.
Yeah, it's one of those, those rules about cabinet shuffles, those who know don't talk, right? And those who talk don't know. And it seems the Bill Blair scenario is part of that. Those who know aren't talking. On the surface of it, if you talk about a military that is struggling with a culture change, with a need to recruit, a need to diversify, Anand had done, capably well managing sexual misconduct in the military, opening up the recruiting pool to permanent residents. There were, apt and able moves there to sort of bring the military as a whole into the 21st century. Therefore, the optics of replacing her, with a former Toronto top cop, the optics just seem such a disconnect there that, okay, there must be a benefit. There must be something else the government sees in putting Bill Blair in charge of that portfolio that they think he can bring. Is it the fact, as he himself said, well, I ran Toronto's police force. I dealt with culture change in the police force. It's a similar culture to the military. Not really, though. I mean, it is and it isn't. Maybe compared to other cabinet ministers, it'll be faster for him to get a handle on all the ranks and all the military nomenclature and all of that cultural component of the armed forces, perhaps. But the idea that we have, for an old boy in charge of what has long been perceived as an old boy club, I don't know how you do that. I don't know how that doesn't send a signal to the troops where, okay, that was all just an experiment, and now we've got the old guy back in charge, and so we're just going to, keep on keeping on. And the military's in front of a lot of crises right now. I mean, what's interesting about moving Bill Blair over, the one thing that I can see there is that he was coming out of emergency preparedness. And one of the files that has been vexing emergency preparedness is this question of, how does Canada prepare and get organized to respond to the ongoing mounting up of climate-related disasters we are facing in this country? And then the question is that the military's job, or is it not the military's job? And if it's not the military's job, then whose job? And perhaps Bill Blair will bring some of that experience from that portfolio as the military seeks to reconstitute itself. We're also, we're waiting on this massive defense policy update, right, that is supposed to allegedly give a new framework for the forces as we head into the next decade. Now Bill Blair's in charge of that, and potentially executing it. Is it a portfolio where he's actually going to get hung out to dry in the end? I'm not sure. It just, I could see the strengths that he could bring to it on the virtue of his background, but they also seem like they could be liabilities in accomplishing some of the things the military says itself wants to do.
If we're talking about caucus management and all this kind of stuff, we'll get to who was left out. But among those who moved, is there any chance for any discontent here? I mean, when there was the cabinet shuffle at the beginning of 2019, when Scott Bryson stepped aside, a couple moves around there had a lot of impact on the government going forward after that. Jody Wilson-Raybould and Jane Philpott not very happy about things. we don't know what's going to happen. It's one of these things where sometimes we'll only be able to identify it in months from now. But is there that potential here, Aaron, any of these moves that could be problematic later on from a personal point of view?
I'm interested to see how David Lametti handles his exit from cabinet. He's been fairly quiet and polite about it so far, I think. But it's such a significant demotion, I guess, and it doesn't have an obvious, public explanation. So it's hard to know exactly what happened there. And whenever somebody gets dropped from cabinet, you wonder how they're going to handle it. I wonder how even Marco Mendicino, to a certain extent, is going to handle being out of cabinet, and whether that leads to ill will either from him or from the people around him or people in Toronto or, those kind of moves. I wonder about that. I haven't gone and done the analysis yet of, where they line up provincially, whether there's a province that's down a minister. But I suspect those will be where the places where people start to ask questions. As Steph said, it's the idea that maybe this was your last shot to get in cabinet. If that feeling sinks into a lot of people, who knows where that goes and what it amounts to. I don't know though that said, if for as long there's sort of two things about Trudeau. One is his caucus management skills were never it was not something that came naturally to him, and I think he's had to work on it significantly. And I don't know, I confess I don't know how well he's kind of gotten to a point. I've heard kind of varying reviews that he's does fairly well at it. But the other part is that there hasn't really been major divides in the Liberal Party since he's been leader. There haven't been, with the exception of SNC and everything that happened in that fallout, there haven't been really kind of big breaks. And every time you shuffle a cabinet, I guess it's kind of there's a risk that you're going to create one of those breaks. But I don't know that I see it happening, but I do see the risk, I guess, of it happening.
Stephanie, do you have anything to add on that?
What I'd be watching for is Anita Anand. And we haven't really touched on the decision to move, like the fact that she's gone away from defense and gone into Treasury Board. And there's been so much chatter about what is Treasury Board? Is that a promotion? Is that a demotion? Is it an economic file? Is it a where you put people to fail? Like, what is it? What is that landing spot that she was given? Is it a landing spot? Did she request it? Did she want it? Those are all of a piece because, and I bring up Anita Anand in particular because of how often her name surfaces in the context of, and one day she will run to replace Justin Trudeau. And you certainly, keep your friends close and your enemies closer kind of thing. If there's folks in cabinet who are actively seeking to mount leadership campaigns one day hence, how far can you go in irritating them? And how far are they willing to go to exert some measure of political payback if they feel like they've been irritated, slighted, pushed aside in any way, or otherwise chastised? Is she, if you think about it sort of in a totality, and Chrystia Freeland's name has now sort of vanished from the mix of people running to replace Justin Trudeau, but if we just keep it there, just for a second, she stays. Melanie Joly, rumored to want to be a leadership contender, she got to stay. And hey, Champagne, Mr. Happy Guy, he got to stay. Well, how come Anita didn't get to stay? What happened? Now, that being said, if Anita Anand said to the Prime Minister, listen, I want to get out of defense, and gave a compelling reason and made a compelling case that she thinks her skills would be best suited at Treasury Board, then Godspeed. I mean, they shouldn't just be held somewhere because they, just to be held there. But again, it just seems strange when the big firefighters of the Trudeau cabinet more or less get to stay or get cool new fires, Dominic LeBlanc, she gets shuffled to this neither here nor there portfolio. If you think back just to the Harper government, just for fun, I was talking about it with some colleagues. Okay, Treasury Board Minister, let's name one. It's Tony Clement. What was Tony Clement's big thing you can think of off the top of your hat? He got the government on Twitter. Right?
I mean, I can think of other things.
Yeah, that wasn't what came to mind for me right away. But
as Treasury Board, as a ministry, if the government finds itself needing to cut costs and she's the one who has to piggyback that, she likely has the skills for it, absolutely. But that'll sink her politically. So it's an interesting place to put someone. Again, but maybe she wanted to go there. We don't necessarily know.
Yeah, that's the thing. You can't tell. When she was taking her oath, there did seem to be, I don't want to read too much into body language, but there did seem to be a weight. And it's hard to know whether it's a weight on the new role or the weight on, I don't want to do this. And I don't know. You never know. It's hard to tell. And again, I'm not going to try to read into anybody's soul.
No, let's read into souls.
Okay.
No, I do think Anita Anand is the like the biggest mystery in the whole thing, and because it's not clear whether she got demoted here, whether this was some kind of getting her wings clipped, or whether, as I've heard it put to me by someone in government, that this is all about putting her in a file where she can be an economic voice, where she can go out and give speeches. I've heard another take that says, if she ever wants to run for leader or, maybe wants to be finance minister someday, this is a good spot to put her to get some of that kind of fiscal, financial, economic sort of credibility. I think a lot depends on the execution, both how well she takes to the job and how well they use her. If she's out giving speeches to every chamber of commerce for the next 2 years, this position looks a little bit different than if she's sitting around the cabinet table saying, I think that costs too much every couple of weeks. I just don't, I think a lot depends on how they execute this. And to a lesser extent, I wonder about, he's not a leadership candidate, so he kind of gets left out of this conversation. But, Jean-Yves Duclos, they arguably did the same thing too. He was in health, and they put him in public services and procurement, which is not exactly the most exciting file in the world. Now, granted, he's not the most exciting man in the world, but he's a minister who has tons of credibility as a serious human being. And if they're just going to bury him, it seems like a waste of talent. And so regardless of what Anita and Ann's ambitions are, or whether there are leadership politics at play here, I think the government would be doing a significant disservice to itself if Duclos and Anand both are sort of just collecting dust on the shelf for the next 2 years and aren't part of some kind of broader, kind of economic approach or messaging approach on sort of building this government's credibility and building its economic case.
I just want to say, though, the spin about Anand and about how, give her economic experience, I find that so condescending. I mean, think like her previous experience in government was business related. She managed the military. It is the sole most expensive thing the government does. She bought vaccines. She bought PPE. Like, she is more than capable. And I find, the language, well, maybe Melanie Joly needs some extra experience somewhere, or maybe Chrystia Freeland could benefit from, going to talk to gun owners for a while. That spin coming out about Anand, I found it really condescending because it sort of undercut the two portfolios she had prior, which, again, big ticket spending. Are we buying jets? Are we buying, that's, that argument, I just wish they wouldn't be making it, because I think it undercuts her ability and her capability as an individual and as a cabinet minister.
Yeah, that's a fair point. I do think to a certain extent it feels like people are grasping at straws at this point to explain why that move was made. And to me, that will be, I know here, I believe she may be doing an interview with CBC's Power and Politics soon. To me, she is the most, she will be the one everyone will be watching for the next 2 months, because everything she does will be a hint of whether this was a brilliant plan or that she's happy with, or a big problem for the government going forward.
The brilliant plan thing is what I wonder about, because the government obviously, because of the size of the cabinet shelf, doesn't want to just be like, we had to make some changes, so we did. They want to cast it as a refresh. But you do wonder how much of it was, all right, you got to let us know if you want to run in the next election. Okay, you don't, they're out. Okay, we got to move this person here. Oh, that would make sense. Let's do this and that, and there you go. And all of a sudden, we've changed half of the ministries. Like, you do wonder how much of it was intentional in that sense, that they said, well, this is the summer, we might as well, 2 years out, we might as well just do a wholesale change, or if it just became a wholesale change because it had to become a wholesale change. We were saying that, I guess, again, when Bryson left, that because Bryson left, they had to make a small change, and it didn't mean anything. There wasn't that much behind it, but obviously there was.
All Scott Bryson's fault. It all goes back to poor old Scott Bryson.
Yeah. His fingerprints are probably on this one somehow, too. If we talk about omissions, So we're focusing on people who could be unhappy. I was surprised Charles Sousa wasn't the one who became the Mississauga minister. Anna Gainey in Montreal was someone that, people thought she was close to the prime minister, that she would probably get in there. There was an opening in Montreal. Stephanie, any odd omissions of people who were left out of this new crew of rookies?
George Chahal in Alberta.
Yeah.
He is one of the lone MPs in the West out there. He's a relative-ish rookie in the Liberal government, but again, they do have a Western representation problem, and will continue to sort of be slogging it out West, mostly with the NDP. I mean, I know we tend to write these seats off. They all belong to the Conservatives, but not necessarily, not in places like Calgary, not in places like Edmonton. You have Randy Boissonnault, of course, carrying a lot of water for them in Alberta, but it would have been interesting to see George Chahal. And again, because of the unfortunate, death of Jim Carr, his son is now, of course, representing him in that seat. No one really expected his son to make the vault into cabinet, but it would have been interesting to see George brought in. Another Sikh man, there's lots of boxes, if I'm going to be sort of cold about it, that George would also check for the government in terms of its diverse representation. So that was an omission that I saw. I thought, actually, I'm just going to leave it there, because to me, you referenced Charles Sousa, I think is another one. I think especially when, the early signaling on this shuffle was about more of an economic focus. Well, he was a finance minister in the Wynne government, for goodness sakes, so there's some economic focus for you. And let's also not forget that the shuffle is only, the first 38 dominoes. There's a bunch of other things that have to happen, right? There's going to be new parliamentary secretaries who are now appointed. So, it would not be shocking, shall we say, should Anna Gainey suddenly become a parliamentary secretary, or Charles Sousa becomes a parliamentary secretary. You have the rather lucrative, in some cases, role of chairs of committees. That can often be seen, depending on your perspective, because you can't be so partisan. But anyway, that can be seen as a reward. So these are the sorts of things where, again, these are the little biscuits that they can, dole out to the dogs nipping at their heels about not getting in, ways to still reward folks for work.
And if the next election is in 2025, there will be some other people who decide maybe now they want to run again, and maybe by the end of the holidays next year, they decide, no, I'm actually done. And so there will be some other opportunities, but those are usually those last minute ones that, if you remember when in the Harper government at the end in 2015, there was a lot of big names that decided they weren't going to be running again. We didn't get that this time. Those four that decided they weren't running again, I wouldn't classify as the highest profile. It wasn't like a James Moore or Peter MacKay or that kind of thing in terms of being seen as regional sort of leaders within the party. Aaron, did we miss any of those omissions that might be upset they didn't get in?
One name that was thrown out to me was Terry Duguid. To talk about losing Jim Carr in Manitoba, there's somebody you might have brought into cabinet because you need some representation in that province now. He's been a Parlsec, I think, for several years. So there would have been a basis, I think, to bring him in. In a lot of other places, I think they just run up against numbers, right? PEI is always the one for me, because as long as Lawrence Macaulay is there and willing to serve, is a Liberal from PEI other than him ever going to get into cabinet? I think the other piece of this is some safe Liberal seats are now potentially going to be up for grabs in the next couple of years. And if you look at Carolyn Bennett's riding, granted, I'm sure some of that support is particularly attached to her, but a Liberal should win that riding fairly comfortably. If you wanted to find a star candidate, that would be one place to put them. And I do think that some of these people saying they're not going to run now opens up some doors, maybe, for some other people to come in, and that could be the sort of next thing to look for.
Yeah, and Joyce Murray in Vancouver Quadra, it's another pretty safe Liberal riding. David Lametti, if he decides not to run again, that's an absolute lock for the Liberals on the island of Montreal, so there will be some opportunities there. While we're talking about the regions and that kind of thing, none of those numbers changed. Every province, it was a 1-for-1. If Quebec lost a minister, it gained a minister. It was like that. And it was really regionally. There wasn't really any changes. The number of ministers in the GTA and Toronto is the same as it was before. The same thing with Vancouver, same thing with Montreal. So clearly they were keeping those regional things in mind. Stephanie, is there an electoral angle to these changes, these promotions into cabinet?
Some smarter minds than mine made the point again about the diversity of the bench and the folks that he chose to elevate and bring in. We've already, of course, talked about Richie Valdez. Arif Farani would be another one from the Toronto area. Gary Ann DeSangrisi, also from the Toronto area. You can read some tea leaves there. You can read some tea leaves about, I wonder how the Liberals think they're doing in certain multicultural communities in this country and whether they've ceded too much ground on that front to the Pierre Poilievre Conservatives, who have been working flat out to rebuild a lot of relationships, campaigning all the time. They're in the GTA every weekend. And the Liberals seem to have, at least visibly, lost that edge. You don't see Liberal cabinet ministers, MPs, members of parliament out in those communities like you used to see them, with the exception, I'd argue, actually, of Anita Anand, who just, following along on any of her socials, she's definitely doing that kind of work. So that was interesting to me in terms of allowing that representation piece and bringing some hopefully fresh voices into the cabinet room saying, hey, how is this policy playing with community X? And that's part of politics. Like, it sounds crass, right? But the Harper Tories did it too. Every policy that comes before the cabinet table needs to be seen through a political lens. What is the win-loss here for us? Is this going to hurt us or not? And, an excellent historical example is the situation with the Kitsilano Coast Guard. Although not ethnic in nature, but the Harper government, despite being warned otherwise by members of its own cabinet and caucus, that if you close that Kitsilano Coast Guard station, it is going to kill us. No, cost savings, we don't need it, forget it. And lo and behold, they lost seats. So it's all that, right? And I think that's where some of the electoral calculus comes in, maybe perhaps a sense that are the Liberals as in touch with voters now as they need to be heading into an election, having those concerns make it all the way up to the decision makers and not just stalled out at the backbench level.
And you look at some of them, Jenna Suds, Kanata Carleton, they actually won by about 3 points. You have Varani, as you mentioned, he won in Parkdale High Park again by about 3 points. Hochelaga, where Sonia Martinez-Ferrada was put in, that was another close riding. And then some of the other ones, they might not have been that close last time, but they are in battlegrounds like Burnaby, North Seymour. Aaron, you mentioned Terry Beach was supposed to be done. He's not. Yarsax in York Centre, that's another kind of riding the Conservatives should win if they form a government. So I don't believe it really helps that much to have a cabinet minister. If anything, it could hurt if the cabinet minister becomes a problem because of decisions they make. Diane Leboutillier is one I'd highlight going in. She's in the Gaspésie-les-Îles-de-Madeleine riding, and she's now fisheries. And so if she does a great job, she could win a riding like the Gaspé, where fisheries is important. If she does a bad job, that riding is getting redrawn. It's going to be really tough for her to win anyway. So, Aaron, how much of it is about the election? How much is it about not the election?
Well, it's always somehow about the election. There's always some electoral concerns. Like I don't want to give the impression that the 7 MPs they put in cabinet are just there because of electoral concerns. Mm-hmm. But you look at the 7 that came in against the 7 that went out. The 7 that went in are significantly younger. They're more diverse. And several of them are in ridings, as you pointed out, where the electoral math is pretty tight. I don't think that's necessarily why any one of those people is in cabinet, but it's certainly a factor. That's just sort of not just political nature, but human nature. You're going to look around and try to figure out what the impacts of those moves are going to be and whether or not they're going to ensure or help that you get reelected next time. That said, this government has maybe, hopefully, possibly learned that you have to be careful with putting political considerations ahead of who you put in cabinet, and putting someone in with a lot of political capital, a lot of political considerations into cabinet can go really badly if it turns out that they're not a great minister or that you're not happy with them. So I suspect they have probably tried to balance those two things, but there's always political considerations, and that's because we live in a democracy, at least for the next little while. So, I think that's just sort of natural to do. And I think it's, to a certain extent, it's you look at this, the 7 going in being sort of younger and more diverse and regionally balanced. I think you want that representation, as Steph says, for the political considerations, but also because you want, your cabinet to a certain extent to look like your voters.
Yeah. and look like the country if you can pull it off, if your caucus looks like the country, which it doesn't always. Let's just finish on this. From both of you, Stephanie, you want to start us off. Does this change your thinking about the next election timing, that kind of thing?
No. Insofar to say the election is Justin Trudeau's to call when Justin Trudeau wants it. The NDP deal guarantees, sure, nothing, in my view, because if, Jagmeet Singh eventually grows tired of propping up the Liberals for whatever reason, he can find a reason to pull them down, just as Justin Trudeau can find a reason to, poison pill a budget, something. If he thinks the conditions are right, he'll call the election. The question is, when will the conditions be right? And perhaps the 2025 deadline sort of gives the, well, okay, not now. Well, okay, not now. And then eventually it's 2025 and we're into an election, so it goes. But I don't think this changes anything. I mean, meaningfully, the government cannot take just a slate of pretty faces to voters. They have to take accomplishments. And these folks need to, as he says they're going to, roll up their sleeves, do the hard work, and prove to Canadians that this government deserves to be reelected. How much time it will take for them to do that, I have no idea.
Yeah, Aaron?
Yeah, I think he did it again yesterday, but I don't think it's a coincidence that every time the Prime Minister talks about when the next election is going to be, or talks about the time frame going forward, he talks about 2 years. He talks about 2025. I think that's his mindset. Look, obviously lots of things can get in the way to change that. But right now, the polling does not suggest that the Liberals should be going to an election anytime soon. And my general sense has been that they need every moment they can in government to build a record to run on. They can't run on, hey, aren't things great and aren't you super happy with us and don't you love our Prime Minister? They're going to have to run on, look at all the stuff we've done, and are you sure you want to do something different? And that means they need as much time in government as they possibly can. And I think the incentives work somewhat the same for the NDP. They need to be able to say to the next, to the voters that the next election, look at all the stuff that we got done because we were there. So I just think the incentives are still there. I mean, that said, governments fall apart for weird reasons. But at this moment, I still think it's 2025.
All right. We'll see what these new cabinet ministers will do over the next 2 years, if that's what they have, and whether it'll have an impact. And as with other cabinet shuffles, sometimes we only know months after the case what it all meant and what's it going to mean going forward. So I appreciate your hot takes. It's been at least had a day to think about it, so it's not as hot as maybe it would have been yesterday. But I appreciate both of you joining me today.
Thanks,
Eric.